Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to make the castle cowl. It is just a cowl of kind of a medieval skyline kind of dealio. I designed this for the Brother KX350 knitting machine. A very similar knitting machine you could compare it to would be the Silver Reed LK150. They're both flatbed mid-gauge machines with like 0 bells and whistles. And for that kind of machine, it can be pretty tricky to like do color work and also make it look good and not be super gappy, and it requires its own skill set. Just like color work with hand knitting, color work with machine knitting is its own skill set. So I kind of wanted to make this video to kind of show you some of the tips and tricks that I do when I do color work, because this design, there's places where like stranded knitting works, and then there's places where intarsia works better, and then there's places where you kind of mesh them together and do techniques of both. So this tutorial video shows you the steps that I took to make this, including the ribbing and binding off and all that, but also some of the like tips and tricks that I used for the color work. So this cowl comes in 2 sizes. There's this super long one with lots of skyline, lots of bridges, and then there's also a smaller one which is about this big. I personally prefer this length. I just like how it fits a little more snugly when you put it on, but I wanted to make the big one just to show you guys what it looks like, the bigger version of it. The 2 yarns that I used here was a Knit Picks worsted weight Wool of the Andes yarn in Midnight Heather, and then Friends wool in gray. So I like that the gray is monochromatic, there's no variation there, and that the blue is actually heathered. So when you get up really close to the light, you can kind of see the heathering there, and I think that's really pretty. So those are the wools I used. On both websites it says that they're a weight 4. I think they're a weight 3, because I mean, I did knit them on kind of a tight gauge, but as you can see, there's like plenty of drape with this bad boy. So like, it's a tight gauge, but it loosened up quite nicely. You do kind of want to go with a bit of a tighter gauge for color work. First tip. Alright, so if you have your colors and your pattern, which you can find the link to these patterns in the description, let's grab all of our supplies and get started. The first step to knit our cowl is we are going to cast on our rows with our gray yarn and work on the ribbing. So if you have a wide enough machine, you can get all 150 stitches on here. I don't. My machine's a little bit too small for that. So I'm actually dividing it into 2, and I'm going to do 2 panels and then seam them together. So I have 75 stitches here that we're going to cast on with our gray yarn. And I have set my row counter to 0 and my tension dial to 4.5. And then I'm just going to cast on with a E-wrap. And now I'm going to knit 8 rows. So the yarn that I'm using here is, I'm using this dark blue Midnight Heather yarn from It's the Wool of the Andes yarn from Knit Picks, and I'm also using some leftover Friends yarn in gray from Hobby. Okay, so now we're going to work on the ribbing. If you have this fancy tool here, you can use it to push every third needle out into position E, like that. And then we're going to want to drop them all back as well. Now for every needle that we pushed into position E and then back into position A, we're going to want to drop those stitches down just until you get to the loop that you created with your E-wrap cast on. Now we take our latch hook here and we find that loop that we made with our E-wrap cast on. And I always need to make it a little bit bigger so I can get my latch hook through it without accidentally dropping it. And then I insert my latch hook and we're just going to find the next bar right above it, pull through. And do that with all the bars. And then we place it back on our needle. Okay, and now we just repeat that for every stitch. So we've finished our ribbing, and now we're starting on the first row of color work. So here I'm going to give you a few quick color work tips. This pattern is fairly simple, it's just the color work is what makes it take a bit, and color work on machine knitting can be kind of tricky. So tip 1 is knowing how your carriage works. So carriages have a few different settings that are important to know for color work. This setting right here, where everything is set to knit, this is our standard setting. That's everything, both of our little levers here, at N. This setting, where the top is at knit and the bottom is at H, what that means is we will knit every row that's in work, but we will not knit stitches or needles that are pushed out into position E. This position, where our bottom row is in N and our top row is in P, is the reverse of that. So we won't knit stitches in work, we will only knit stitches pushed out into our position E, which can be helpful because sometimes you don't want to have to keep putting the same stitches out over and over, so it's kind of nice to flip between these two methods. So we're keeping our tension at 4.5, our row counter's still at 8, and our carriage is in the hold setting, so that means that the bottom switches are on H and the top is on N. So basically that means it's not going to knit anything that's pushed out, it's only going to knit all of our stitches that are in work back here. Alright, and now we remove our yarn, kind of wrap it around, and then we're going to pick up our carriage and bring it over to the other side. Grab our other yarn color. Okay, and then we're going to change this to the P setting. So bottom row's on end, top panel is on P, and we're only going to be knitting everything pushed out here. Oop. And there we go. So sometimes you want to just give everything a quick once over, especially the first few couple rows, because sometimes the machine's not perfect and it will just skip rows on accident. So now we're going to use our row counter, go up to the next row. So at this point I stopped paying attention to what our row counter on our actual machine says, because You're gonna knit 2 rows for every row at a minimum. Sometimes you're gonna knit 3 or 4, just depending on how many different like balls of yarn you're using at any given time. So I keep track on my actual like physical color chart. Now you could always just change this every row, but I find that to be kind of redundant. So that's why I don't do that. And now we're just gonna kind of wanna work on our knitting every color row. And when I come to a spot where I feel like I can show you something new, I will show you it. Something you're going to start noticing is these long floats at the back of your panel. Something you want to keep an eye out for are floats that get too long. See this float here, that's pretty long. This one's pretty long too. This is passable length. It's definitely longer than we'd like for a float, but we can go in later and secure the float to the back of the panel if we don't want to do intarsia knitting, because you could always just intarsia knit this section instead of what we're doing right now, which is more akin to stranded knitting. But what that basically means is this would have its own little ball of yarn and you knit this as if it's its own like color section instead of putting them all out and knitting one color all at once. You would knit your gray for these two, you'd knit gray for these, and then you'd have a third one and knit gray for that. Because if you just knit these two, you skipped this and knit that, that means you'd have a float from here to here, which is crazy long. Here you'll see we have a very big chunk of one color. This will be our gray color. And if this was more than one row, I would say that this should get its own ball of yarn and we should do intarsia. But this is just one row. It's a section of the bridge. And it just so happens to not have very many breaks of different colors in it. So we're gonna knit it and hope it works out fine. So something else you'll notice is that you have to pick up and move your carriage every row. Now, what you could do is start your yarn on opposite ends. So start one color on this end and one color on the other end and just alternate. The difficulty with that for me is I forget which yarn I've done. So I have to take the extra time to pick up my carriage and rotate it every time, or else I'll just forget. So it's really what works best for you. If you can remember which row you've already knit, and if you can remember what color you've already worked, then go for it. It's definitely more efficient to rotate your colors. But if you can't remember, or if you like find yourself getting interrupted, like with other thoughts and other things you need to go do, like me, then I would stick to keeping it as simple as possible. Something else you can do to reduce errors is keep your carriage on one setting the whole time. In this case, that would mean it would need to be the P setting, and you just push out the needles you want to work. That way you're always knitting the color that you're expecting to be knitting. You don't accidentally knit rows or stitches you didn't think you would be knitting. You don't have to mess with carriage settings all the time. It does take more time because you have to push the needles out every time instead of once every row. You have to do it twice every row. And you've got to make sure you don't accidentally like push out the wrong needles. So there's room for error with that, but I find that switching my carriage all the time does cause me to make mistakes occasionally. So coming up in the pattern, we are going to have a lot of just empty blue space. What I've decided to do for the stars in the sky is I'm going to actually duplicate stitch over those later. I think it'll just be neater, it'll have less holes. I think it will just be easier altogether. So any of the stars, those are going to be put in later, so we can just kind of ignore those for now. So we kind of have this rectangle here of just straight up blue, and I don't necessarily want to have to carry that over every time over this. Over that is not such a big deal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this into two blue sections. This and this little rectangle. And then once they meet up, we'll combine it back into one and use one ball of yarn. Okay, so for this row, my yarn is kind of in the middle of the row. I have these stitches out. We are going to work on hold, and something we're going to do actually is we're going to wrap this. And that way when we knit this with the gray, it will kind of grab that yarn and it's not going to separate. So we're wrapping it around that stitch. We have a carriage on H, and you want to lay the yarn on top of the needles. Under the needles, and you'll have a huge bit of loose thread. On top of the needles, and you'll have just a little loop, like what you're wanting to do. You'll notice that I also had these out here over on hold because we don't want to knit those right now. One of these, and we will hand knit these guys. So you'll notice here that we have this huge chunk of blue, and it's going to stay for quite a while, which means that from this tower to this tower, we're going to have that long of a gray strand, and I don't want that. That's way too long. So what we're going to do is we're going to have this tower, like this tiny house and this tower, and this tower have their own balls of yarn. So it'll be so as soon as you have more than 2 active balls of yarn that you're working with, I prefer to only use the method where your carriage is in the P position. So that way you push out what you want to knit. And that simple rule helps keep me from pushing out the wrong stitches at the wrong time, or knitting on the wrong carriage setting, or knitting the wrong color at the wrong time, because I've done all 3 of those things in the span of recording this. So I find it hard to just keep track of what I'm supposed to be doing at any given time, so that's my personal rule. One, two, three, skimp, skimp. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1. Another trick you can do is, before I would knit these for the blue stitches, I'm going to wrap this around and knit one, and then I just remember to not knit this stitch again. And then I can do that with any strand of yarn that is available in next to one of these. Here's another example. We have this bit here, and this is the like turret castle, and you know, sometimes it's going to be on the left. As you can see, I did that right here. You kind of see that little bump where I looped it around, and I'm going to do the same thing over here on the right. Just kind of loop it and do that. And you just got to keep in mind that you already knit one stitch over here and to not knit it twice. Sometimes when it's that few stitches, like it's literally 4 stitches, it's just easier to hand knit it instead of machine knitting it. Although it's not hand knitting in the traditional sense, it's hand knitting by using hand manipulation, not by using a traditional like set of needles. Oh, the heck. All right, and now we get our fun rows of just knitting as normal. And we're gonna knit our 8 rows of ribbing. Eight. All right. So now we're just going to do the same thing we did with the bottom here up at the top. We're going to drop every 4th stitch. And then knit up with our latch hook. And we only really want to drop it down until we get to the different color here. So. Oh my goodness. And then we're going to repeat that with all of the other stitches that we dropped. And then we're just going to cast off. So here is a good example of a problem you can run into while doing color work. So I'm currently on row 18 on the second part, and what you can see here is that for the last several rows I've been knitting this gray section right here all on its own without letting my blue yarn float over it. So what that means is now my blue yarn starts kind of in the middle on the left side, and now on this row we actually have some blue spots that are going to be poking out up here. That's going to give us the turrets in the castle. The issue that we see here is the fact that this blue yarn starts in the middle. If this was on the left, we could just easily glide it across all of them, but we have it here in the middle. We do have this one on the right where we could do this and knit it across all of them, but I want to use this one up just out of personal preference, but I can't go both directions. So I can't knit here and then push these ones that need to be knit, these blue ones, out and then knit those, because we'll have a huge float. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit to the left with these and knit to the left with this, and then we'll cut this and just work with this for a while. The reason that I don't want to just start with the one on the right over here is this guy over here I was able to secure by wrapping it around this one this time. So I kind of just want to be able to keep that secure row that I made, because you know how before we would pull it out and then wrap it around, like pull this out, wrap it, and then do that? Well, I was able to do that for this one, and I just want to keep that stability in there for this row. So we're going to knit this with this yarn, and then we're going to knit the next chunk with this yarn from over here. Another reason that's advantageous for me to have done that is that this working yarn, there's not a lot left of this. There's no way it would be enough for the rest of this panel, but there is plenty of working yarn left on this side. So at least I won't have to change yarns. Again, that's kind of a personal preference thing. There's nothing wrong with changing yarns. Okay, another technique that you can do to secure your yarn so there's not holes in your knitting is, here we have two live yarns right next to each other. So that's the first thing you need to use this technique. And the second thing you need to do is just make sure that they're across each other. So for example, if I was going to knit this next, I would want this in front of it. That way there's going to be kind of a little X that forms, and this yarn, when we knit it back, is going to get caught and looped around like that. So that's a very easy technique, and if you can use that one, I definitely recommend it. It just needs a very specific set of circumstances. So to seam these together, you can either use a invisible vertical stitch, like a mattress stitch, or we can use the machine knitting technique, which I'm going to show you here. So I've picked up all of my stitches, right side facing, and I basically done pick up 3, skip 1, so that it's not too stretched out. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put this on the same side. But you will notice this is the wrong way, because if we seam these together, it's going to look like that. It's going to end up having like it be upside down. So make sure it's the right side, like this. So I'm going to pick it up on the same needles and real quick to check, yep, it's the right way, because it creates our skyline. And now we take some waste yarn and we cast off. I recommend using yarn that's still the same color as your main yarn. You could also go with the ribbing yarn or just any color really, but first stitch is always tricky. I like using yarn that's in the same color scheme just because sometimes it can peek through and it's just nice if it matches. It's a little harder to see mistakes. So now I'm going to show you how I use duplicate stitch to make our little stars throughout our pattern. So here I have our pattern, the full one in length, and we're going to use that to show us where the stars are going to be. So right now we're working on this main star right here, which is directly above this sky right here. So I took a bit of waste yarn for the gray color, and I basically left a bit of a tail, and I've been working these as I go, and so that there's not just like a loose thread hanging out, I've been doing this kind of putting it into the back of the panel so that it's easier to not catch it on stuff, and then later I will just weave in this end. So we're going to start at the bottom of this star and work our way up, and then go left to right, and then work our way up. There are 6 blue stitches in between this star and the star that we're going to work, so we'll skip 6 stitches. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll put our needle in here. Okay, and now we are going to create the duplicate stitch. So we have We've put our needle through the V right directly below the stitch we want to create. Now we are going to pick up the two legs of the stitch above it, pull through, and then insert our needle back into the area that we came out of. There you go. And now we're going to continue up the star pattern. So we go into the V of the stitch we just created, pull through, go into the stitch above us, insert back in, you can also go from right to left when you insert your needle, but I find that doing left to right makes the stitch just a little bit neater. Now we've done our 4 that are all in a row, and now we come to our first row of 3. So I'm actually going to go over to the left. So we would normally go into this stitch, but we want to go into this one to the left of it. Okay, and then we are going to do what we normally do. There we go. And now this next row is a very long one. So this one is 7 stitches long. So we want to go over to weep, weep to this stitch right here. All right, there we go. I think that's my best row yet. And now we're gonna do the next row, which is just a group of 3. And now we just do the top. All right, and there's our star. I'm definitely not an expert at this, but the technique is sound. You just have to get get used to the tension, because I have a few places here where clearly my tension's too loose and a few places where my tension's too tight. But once this is all done, we are going to go ahead and block it anyways, and that will help with some of the puckering that is happening here. But yeah, I still prefer duplicate stitch for the stars just because it makes the actual knitting part of this a lot easier to do. So maybe for like big stars like this, you could use regular knitting. Honestly, it's all up to you. You can do whatever you'd like. But definitely for these tiny stars, I would recommend doing duplicate stitch. I also ended up seaming this guy with just regular invisible vertical like mattress stitch because the technique with the machine works totally fine, but it does leave a visible seam, and you can like very barely tell that this is where I seamed it just because of the like differences at the top here. You can kind of see that difference, and you can kind of see this difference, but otherwise it's a lot less visible to do it that way. So that's why I ended up doing it that way. Next, I'm just going to finish the rest of the stars, and then I'm going to seam these ends together. So it will end up looking like a cowl. And then we will block it once more and try it on. Here's what this bad boy looks like on. And if you had the shorter version, this is kind of what it would look like. Kind of here. So I like it a little more snug, personally. I like the shorter one. The difference in the design is I took off one of the buildings, and I also kind of squished some of the like bridges to make it shorter, so it's about 30 stitches shorter. I'm thinking about adding a hood to this, or making just like a hood version of this. So if that's something you guys are interested in, let me know, because I do really like the simplicity of the kind of medieval castle skyline. I think it looks really cute, and it's like easily conveyable what it is. Like you don't have to, I don't know, it doesn't take more than 2 colors to convey it. I like how simple it is, but I like how like clear it is as well. So it's just a design I really like, and shout out to my husband for giving me the idea of the moon. I don't even know why I didn't think of a moon. I just had a bunch of stars in the background, and he was like near me while I was working, and he's like, you should think about adding a moon. So I added a moon, and it really completed the piece. So shout out to him. He probably won't watch this, but thank you, babe. Alright friends, thanks for joining me on this tutorial video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you like your cowl, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer those. If you're looking for the cowl, that can be found in my Etsy, which is linked in the description. Thank you so much. I'll see y'all next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you later. Bye!